She was 19 and all but penniless, a life folded into a single small carpetbag. Her family, what little remained of it, had turned her out with the quiet finality of a closing door. She had £2 to her name, a handful of shillings, and a silver locket that held no currency in the world, but was all the inheritance she claimed. With that small sum, she bought a ruin, a derelict manor in the damp heart of Yorkshire, known as Blackwood. But what nobody in the village of Oakhaven knew, what even the solicitor who sold it to her for a pittance could not have guessed, was that sealed within its crumbling western wing lay a secret that had slept for 50 years. A secret of gold and regret that would not only change her life, but rewrite the history of a family that had cast her grandmother out into the cold. This is the story of Alice Pemberton and the house that was waiting for her. Settle in, and let us tell you how a forgotten key and a dusty ledger gave a dismissed girl back her name. Alice Pemberton had been born into the shadow of a loss she could not at first name. She grew up in a small, rented cottage on the frayed edge of a town, a place of mended linens and the constant, gentle scent of her grandmother's baking. Her parents were ghosts in the narrative of her life, taken by a fever when she was too young to form a lasting memory of their faces. It was her grandmother, Eleanor, who had been her world. Eleanor was a woman of quiet strength, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, but always deft, whether she was turning the heel of a sock, tending to her small patch of herbs, or showing Alice how to make a perfect flaky pastry with nothing more than a little flour, lard, and cold water. She taught Alice everything she knew, not with formal lessons, but through the patient rhythm of their days. She taught her to read from a worn Bible and to keep accounts in a neat, spiky hand in a small ledger. She taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew in the hedgerows and which ones could be used to soothe a cough or ease a fever. Most importantly, she taught her the value of self-reliance, a lesson imparted not in words, but in the steady, uncomplaining way she met each day's hardships. Eleanor had once been part of a different world. In hushed tones, she sometimes spoke of a grand house with a walled garden, of a father who was a lord, and of a life she had given up for love. She had married a poor scholar, a man her father had deemed unworthy, and for that she had been disowned, her name struck from the family records. The only token she had from that life was a small, exquisitely painted miniature of herself as a girl, which she kept in a locked box. When Eleanor passed away, leaving Alice an orphan for the second time at the age of 16, that locked box and its contents were sold to cover the funeral costs. The only thing Alice had managed to keep was a small, plain silver locket her grandmother had always worn, a gift from her husband. Inside was a tiny, faded curl of her grandmother's hair. It was this locket that Alice now carried, a cool, smooth weight in her pocket, a tangible link to the only person who had ever loved her without condition. After her grandmother's death, she had been sent to live with a distant cousin of her father's, a stern, parsimonious woman, who saw her as little more than an unpaid servant. For 3 years Alice endured the cold charity, her grief a private, silent thing. The end of her time in that house came not with a shout, but with the rustle of a solicitor's letter. Her cousin, Martha, sat her down at the kitchen table, the polished wood cold beneath Alice's hands. Martha did not meet her eye, focusing instead on a loose thread on her own apron. "The house is sold," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My husband and I are moving to a smaller cottage in the city. There will not be room for you." It was a statement of fact, as simple and as brutal as a slammed door. There was no discussion, no offer of alternative arrangements, no pretense of concern. Alice was an inconvenience, a loose end to be tied off and discarded. She did not plead or weep. The lessons of her grandmother had taken deep root. She had learned to stand on her own feet, even when the ground beneath them was crumbling. She simply nodded, a small, stiff movement of her head. "I understand," she said, her own voice steady. a small miracle of control. That evening she packed her belongings. It did not take long. She had a single change of clothes, her grandmother's worn book of herbal remedies, a small sewing kit, and the precious silver locket. Her cousin gave her £2, the last of the small sum her father had left, which Martha had been holding for her keep. It was meant as a final severance, a payment to clear a conscience, but to Alice it was a lifeline. She placed the coins carefully in a small leather pouch. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she walked out of the house without a backward glance. The air was cold and sharp, and the sky was the color of slate. She carried her small bag in one hand, her shoulders straight, her face set. She was 19 years old, alone in the world, with £2 and a handful of memories. She did not know where she was going, only that she was moving forward, away from a life of servitude and towards an unknown future that she would have to build for herself, one step at a time. The silence of the empty road was not frightening. It was a promise. It was the sound of her own life, finally beginning. The road stretched before her, a muddy ribbon, winding through the vast, empty expanse of the Yorkshire moors. For 3 days Alice walked. The weather was a fickle companion, shifting from a pale, watery sunlight that cast long shadows across the heather to a driving, slanting rain that soaked her thin coat and chilled her to the bone. She walked with a steady, determined pace, her boots, already worn, growing heavy with mud. At night she sought shelter in the barns of sympathetic farmers, paying for a bed of hay with a few precious pennies and the quiet offer of her skills, mending a torn shirt or darning a stack of socks by the flickering light of a lantern. She ate sparingly, a piece of bread and cheese here, a cup of weak tea there, hoarding her small store of money with a fierce protectiveness. The landscape was beautiful in its starkness. The rolling hills a tapestry of muted greens and browns, the sky a vast dramatic canvas of shifting clouds. But Alice saw it less as a picturesque scene and more as a challenge to be overcome. Each mile was a small victory, each sunrise a fresh start. She was guided by a rumor, a snippet of conversation she had overheard in her last village. A derelict manor house, Blackwood, in the parish of Oakhaven, was to be sold for a pittance. The owner, a distant relative of the original family, lived in London and wanted only to be rid of the burden of its taxes. The name Blackwood had snagged in her memory, a faint echo from one of her grandmother's stories. It was a long shot, a fool's hope perhaps, but it was the only hope she had. As she crested a hill on the 3rd day, weary and footsore, she saw it in the distance. A small village nestled in a valley, a church spire piercing the gray sky, and on a rise overlooking the village, a dark, skeletal shape against the clouds, the ruins of a great house. It was Blackwood Manor. Her heart gave a small, nervous flutter. From this distance it looked more like a tomb than a house, a place of shadows and decay. Yet, as she began her descent into the valley, a strange sense of purpose settled over her. This was it. This was her destination. The journey had been a stripping away of everything that was not essential, leaving only her own resilience. She was no longer a dismissed girl. She was a pilgrim, and that dark shape on the hill was her unlikely shrine. The village of Oakhaven was a cluster of stone cottages, a public house, a small church, and a general store, all huddled together as if for warmth against the vastness of the surrounding moors. The air smelled of damp earth, coal smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of baking bread. The villagers watched her as she walked down the main street, their gazes curious but not unkind. She was a stranger, and her worn clothes and solitary state marked her out. Alice, however, was not intimidated. She walked directly to the small office of Mr. Abernathy, the local solicitor, whose name she had been given. He was a small, fussy man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and he looked at her with undisguised astonishment when she stated her purpose. "You wish to buy Blackwood Manor?" he asked, his voice a squeak of disbelief. "My dear young lady, The place is a ruin. It hasn't been properly inhabited for 50 years. The roof is gone in places, the windows are shattered, and the west wing is, well, it's sealed. He peered at her over his spectacles. And you have the funds. Alice placed her £2 on his desk. The solicitor stared at the coins, then back at her. A flicker of something. Pity, perhaps, or a grudging respect, crossed his face. The asking price is indeed £2, he admitted, to cover the outstanding taxes and the deed transfer. The owner considers it worthless. He sighed, then straightened a stack of papers on his desk. Very well, if you are certain. The transaction was swift. Alice signed her name, Alice Pemberton, in her neat, careful hand. In return, she was given a heavy, yellowed piece of parchment, the deed to Blackwood Manor. She folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. With the key, a single large, rusted piece of iron, in her hand, she walked back out into the village street. The purchase had left her with only a few shillings. She was the owner of a ruined manor, but she was also practically destitute. She made her way up the winding path to the house. The closer she got, the more daunting it appeared. The gardens were a tangled wilderness of weeds and thorns. The stone walls were stained black with damp, and many of the windows were dark, gaping holes. The front door hung crookedly on one hinge, and there on the left was the west wing, a solid, windowless block of stone, its only visible door barred and bolted from the outside, as if sealing something in. It was a place of profound neglect, a monument to decay. But as Alice stood before it, key in hand, she felt not despair, but a flicker of something else, a sense of ownership, of belonging. This ruin was hers. It was a broken, forgotten thing, just like her, and together they might just find a way to be whole again. The first few weeks were a battle for survival. Alice found a small, relatively dry room at the back of the house, a former scullery with a stone floor and a small, intact window. The roof above it seemed to have held, and she spent her first days patching it with slates she salvaged from other, more ruinous parts of the house. She used her remaining shillings to buy a small sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a few candles from the village store. She swept the floor, scrubbed the walls, and built a small fire in the hearth, coaxing a flame from damp wood and sheer determination. The smoke stung her eyes, but the warmth was a blessing, a small pocket of civilization in the vast, cold emptiness of the manor. During the day, she worked tirelessly. She cleared a small patch of the overgrown garden, her hands raw and blistered as she tore out brambles and weeds, uncovering the rich, dark earth beneath. She found a neglected apple tree, its branches heavy with small sour fruit, and she carefully harvested them, storing them for the winter. She was a solitary figure, moving through the ruins with a quiet purpose that baffled the villagers who sometimes watched her from a distance. They saw a young woman attempting the impossible, and they waited for her to give up. But Alice did not give up. As she worked, she explored. The house was a labyrinth of decaying rooms, filled with the ghosts of a forgotten life. Dust lay thick as snow on everything, but beneath the grime she found hints of its former grandeur. A fragment of silk wallpaper, a carved mantelpiece, a beautifully turned banister. And always her attention was drawn back to the west wing. It stood apart from the rest of the house, silent and impenetrable. The main door was made of solid oak, reinforced with iron straps and secured by a heavy bar on the outside. There were no windows on the ground floor. It was as if the house itself had turned its back on that part of its structure. One rainy afternoon, driven inside, Alice began a systematic search. She ran her hands along the walls of the corridor that led to the sealed wing, tapping the plaster, listening for a hollow sound. And she found it. Behind a section of peeling, water-stained wallpaper, the outline of a smaller hidden door was faintly visible. It was not locked, but it was stuck fast, swollen shut by years of damp. Using a small crowbar she had found in an outbuilding, she worked patiently, leveraging it open inch by painful inch. Finally, with a groan of protesting wood, the door swung inward, opening into a dark, narrow passage. A wave of stale, cold air washed over her. Lighting a candle, she stepped inside. The passage led to another door, this one unlocked. She turned the handle and pushed. It opened into a vast, silent room. It was a library. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings covered in a fine layer of dust. Furniture stood draped in white dust sheets, like sleeping giants. In the center of the room was a large mahogany desk. It was here, in this room, frozen in time, that she felt a palpable sense of presence, as if someone had just left. She ran a hand over the dusty surface of the desk and found a small, locked drawer. After a moment's search, she found the key in a small, carved wooden box on the mantelpiece. With a trembling hand, she unlocked the drawer. Inside, there was not just one item, but several. A stack of gold sovereigns, gleaming in the candlelight, a small, leather-bound journal, and a thick, sealed envelope addressed in a firm, elegant hand, "To whomever finds this." Alice's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal on the envelope. The paper inside was thick and brittle with age. She carried it, along with the journal and the small pouch of gold coins, back to her small, habitable room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. By the light of her fire, she carefully unfolded the letter. The ink was faded but still legible. It was dated 1815, almost 50 years ago. "My name is Lord Ashworth," the letter began, "and this was my home. If you are reading this, it means I am long dead, and the measures I have taken have come to fruition. I write this not as an apology, for the ink of the past cannot be unwritten, but as an explanation and as a hope for a future I will not see." The letter went on to describe a story that mirrored her grandmother's in heartbreaking detail. Lord Ashworth wrote of his only daughter, Eleanor, a bright, spirited girl whom he adored. He wrote of her love for a young man of no fortune, a scholar with a mind full of poetry but pockets full of air. Lord Ashworth's wife, a woman of rigid social ambition, had been horrified. She, along with their powerful neighbors, had pressured him to forbid the match. Weakly, and to his eternal regret, he had complied. He had presented his daughter with an ultimatum: abandon the man or be cast out. Eleanor, with the same quiet strength Alice now possessed, had chosen love. "I drove my own daughter from my door," he wrote. The words blurred in one spot as if a tear had fallen there. "I have not seen her since. I have lived with the silence of her absence for 5 years, and it is a silence that has hollowed me out. My wife is gone now, and I am alone in this great, empty house. I have tried to find Eleanor, but she and her husband have vanished. I fear she believes I hate her. I do not. I was a coward." The letter explained that he had sealed the West Wing, his private domain, to preserve it from his wife's family, who he knew would descend upon his death. The gold sovereigns, a sum of £500, were his personal savings, hidden for his daughter. And then came the final, devastating blow. With the letter was a second document, his true last will and testament, legally drawn and witnessed by 2 loyal servants who had since passed away. It disinherited his grasping nephews and named his daughter, Eleanor Pemberton, as the sole heir to Blackwood Manor and the entire Ashworth estate. Alice stared at the documents, her grandmother's story and her own life snapping into sharp, painful focus. Her grandmother had not been merely disowned. She had been cheated. Alice, her last living descendant, was the rightful owner of this house and everything in it. She picked up the small leather journal. It was her great-grandfather's. The last entry, written in a shaky hand, read, "I leave this for the one who has the wit to find it. May it be my Eleanor or her child. May it restore what my foolish pride has broken. May it bring them home." Alice looked around the small, bare room, at the crumbling plaster and the smoke-stained ceiling. She was home. The discovery of the will and the gold changed everything. The 500 sovereigns were a fortune, enough to not only secure her own future, but to begin the monumental task of restoring Blackwood Manor. For a day, Alice did nothing but sit with the knowledge, letting the weight of it settle into her bones. This was not just a house, it was a legacy. It was a story of loss and regret, but also of a love that had reached across 50 years to find her. The next morning, she rose with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a restorer. She walked into Oakhaven, not as a destitute stranger, but as the lady of the manor. Her first visit was to Mr. Abernathy, the solicitor. She laid the will on his desk. He read it, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. He read it again, then looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and professional excitement. This is extraordinary," he stammered. "It appears to be perfectly legal, properly witnessed. This changes everything, Miss Pemberton. You are not just the owner of the ruin, you are the heir to the entire Ashworth estate." The news spread through the village like wildfire. Alice Pemberton, the strange girl who had bought the ruin, was the granddaughter of the lost lord's daughter. She was one of them, in a way. The initial wariness of the villagers began to melt away, replaced by a grudging respect and a growing curiosity. Alice, with Mr. Abernathy's help, began the process of rebuilding. She did not throw money around. She was careful, methodical, just as her grandmother had taught her to be. Her first hire was Mr. Gable, a stonemason in his late 60s, with hands like gnarled oak roots and a knowledge of local stone that ran generations deep. He surveyed the crumbling walls of the manor with a critical eye. "The bones are good," he declared, tapping a large cornerstone with his hammer. "It'll take work, but she'll stand proud again." He and his 2 sons began the slow, painstaking work of repointing the mortar, replacing shattered stones and securing the foundations. Next, she hired Thomas, a young carpenter with a quiet manner and a gifted hand. He was fascinated by the old house and took a craftsman's pride in his work. He began by repairing the roof, carefully sourcing new slates to match the old ones. Then he moved inside, mending floorboards, rebuilding window frames, and restoring the beautiful carved staircase that had been half-rotted with damp. Alice worked alongside them, not as a lady directing her servants, but as a fellow laborer. She hauled water, mixed mortar, and learned to plaster walls under Mr. Gable's patient instruction. She spent her evenings in the restored library, poring over the estate ledgers she had found, learning about the lands and tenants that were now her responsibility. She was not just rebuilding a house, she was rebuilding a life, a community, stone by stone, plank by plank. As the weeks turned into months, Blackwood Manor slowly began to shed its skin of decay. The gaping holes in the roof were filled, and new glass glittered in the window frames, catching the pale Yorkshire light. The scent of damp and dust was gradually replaced by the clean smells of fresh plaster, sawdust, and beeswax. The community of Oakhaven, drawn in by the steady, quiet work, began to coalesce around Alice. It was not a community built on grand declarations of friendship, but on small, practical acts of kindness and mutual respect. Mrs. Albright, the vicar's wife, a woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, started bringing Alice a hot meal every evening, a shepherd's pie or a hearty stew in a covered basket. "You can't live on bread and apples alone, dear," she would say, her presence a comforting warmth in the large, still empty house. In return, Alice helped her plan the church's new garden, using the knowledge her grandmother had passed down. Mr. Gable, the stonemason, would often stay late, sharing a pipe with his sons by the fire, telling Alice stories of the old Lord Ashworth, a man he remembered as a boy. "He was a good man," Mr. Gable said one evening, his voice thoughtful, "just a sad one." Thomas, the carpenter, began leaving small, beautifully carved objects for her to find. A little wooden bird on a windowsill, a smooth, polished box for her sewing things. He never mentioned them, and she never thanked him directly, but a quiet understanding grew between them, as solid and as well-fitted as the joints he crafted. The manor itself began to breathe again. Alice opened up the rooms one by one, cleaning them, repairing them, and furnishing them with the restored pieces she found in the west wing. She turned the scullery, where she had spent her first desperate nights, into a bright, functional kitchen. The grand dining room, which had been a haven for birds and rats, was now a place of polished wood and gleaming silver, ready to host a meal. She began to manage the estate, meeting with the tenant farmers, listening to their concerns, and making fair and just decisions. She was firm but kind, and they quickly came to respect her. The name Alice Pemberton became known not as the strange girl who bought a ruin, but as the Lady of Blackwood Manor, a title she wore not with arrogance, but with a quiet, earned dignity. The house was no longer a burden or a symbol of loss. It had become a living place, a refuge, and a source of her authority, filled with the hum of work and the warmth of growing community. The day came when the last of the major repairs was finished. The great oak door of the west wing, once barred and sealed, now stood open, leading into a wing of the house that was no longer a tomb, but a sanctuary of memory. Alice stood in the newly restored library, the heart of her great-grandfather's world. The room was filled with the soft, late-afternoon light, which illuminated the rich colors of the book's spines and the warm glow of the polished mahogany desk. The air smelled of leather, wood smoke from the crackling fire, and the faint, pleasant scent of beeswax. This room, which had once been a dusty relic of a forgotten past, was now the center of her life. She ran her hand over the back of a large leather armchair, its surface supple and warm. From this window, she could see the gardens, no longer a tangled wilderness, but a series of neat productive beds and winding gravel paths. The apple tree she had found in her first week stood proudly, its branches pruned and healthy. The house was alive, and it was hers. On the mantelpiece, above the fire, she had placed two small objects, side by side. One was the silver locket her grandmother had given her, its surface worn smooth by the touch of her fingers. The other was a small, exquisitely painted miniature of a young girl with bright, intelligent eyes, the portrait of her grandmother, Eleanor, that she had found in Lord Ashworth's desk. Two tokens from two people who had loved a woman they had lost, now brought together by the granddaughter they had never known. She thought of the relatives who had cast her out, not with bitterness, but with a distant, quiet pity. They had seen her as a burden, a thing to be discarded. They had no idea of the strength she carried within her, the legacy that was waiting for her in the heart of a ruined house. They had given her £2 to be rid of her, and with those £2, she had bought back her name, her home, and her future. What had begun as the deepest loss had become her greatest belonging. Alice Pemberton was 19 years old and had been homeless, with nothing but £2 and a memory to her name. She spent that small fortune on a crumbling, forgotten manor in the Yorkshire countryside, a place everyone else had abandoned. It was the best £2 she ever spent, for in the heart of that ruin, she found not just shelter, but a home. She found not just a hidden treasure, but a hidden history that was her own. She found the story of a grandmother's strength, a great-grandfather's regret, and the enduring power of a love that refused to be erased. She had arrived a solitary, dismissed girl, and now she stood as the mistress of Blackwood Manor, her life not given to her, but built with her own 2 hands, stone by patient stone. The house had been waiting, and in healing its wounds, she had finally, irrevocably, healed her own.